Well, that's unfortunate. I was hoping that you would have some more to say. Well, I'll wait till you set up before we can.
Yeah, where's Mr. Davenport?
He's discussion.
Is he touched the bus now?
Sorry.
You ever touched the bus?
Yes. It's,
I'm not touching it there.
all right.
Why did he leave the province if he was so hell-bent on staying in front of Fredericton City Hall?
He wasn't.
At his home.
He wasn't hell-bent on staying in front of the City Hall. That's distortion. The mayor wants to use for
But
his
if he changed his address to City Hall,
He changed his address, actually. If you read the lawsuit, it says right in the lawsuit why. According to Section 96 of the Motor Vehicle Act, you have to let Service New Brunswick know where you are. So on your driver's license, there are actually two addresses. There's your residential address and your mailing address. With most people, those are the same addresses. With Mr. Davenport's, they were not. So we went to Service New Brunswick and explained the situation. At the time, he didn't have another address. He didn't have an apartment or a house of his own. So we went to Service New Brunswick and asked what they wanted us to do. And they said, okay, well, you were at the shelter there in front of City Hall most of the time. So we'll set that as your residential address. And they actually set his mailing address as my address. Eventually, at first, they said, so it's complicated. At first, they set both residential and mailing addresses in front of City Hall, and Canada Post started to deliver his mail there. But when it, we decided that we weren't going to be there much longer, regardless of what the mayor said, we were going to take it down ourselves. So at that time, we changed the mailing address to my house.
Can you talk about the monetary part of this settlement? Can you talk about the monetary part of the settlement and some of the claims that the mayor made?
Yes, I can. Now, I think that the money is really a sideshow to this whole thing, and he's trying to distract from the real issues here. But I will address it. So, as for the money, the total amount is $14,350. The lawsuit was asking for $15,000, plus $1,600 for property, so $16,600 total. As for that amount, Mr. Woodside, I'm not sure if he understands the legal process that well, because when you sue somebody in court, you have to sue for money. Did he expect us to sue for jelly beans? I mean, of course we're suing for money. That's what we sue for. If we could have sued, put him and Murray Jane were the ones who falsely accused us of violating the law. If we could have sued for, a couple months jail sentence each, we would have done that, because I think that would have taught them their lesson better. But that's not the way the legal system works. So our public officials need to understand that there will be consequences to their actions. So if they falsely accuse people of breaking the law, then they need to understand that they might have to pay the price. So in this case, when I say falsely accuse us of breaking the law, it was false in the most egregious way possible. The bylaw provisions they accused us of violating don't even exist. And that's kind of the elephant that has been stampeding around the room for the past while.
What did you accomplish?
With what? The lawsuit?
Well, period. What did you accomplish by being there and then suing them?
And then suing them? Well, actually, if you go to my website, I write that out in long form.
Actually, maybe you could tell people.
Yeah, julianrenaud.ca. But I will.
Who do you represent, by the way? Who do you represent now? That was 2 years ago.
Who I represent?
Yeah, that was 2 years ago. Who do you represent now?
I represent myself.
Okay, so.
I'm a citizen in a democracy. I'm doing my civic duty here. That's what I represent.
So after 2 years, what did you accomplish?
What did I accomplish? Well, I hope that this accomplishes a number of things. First of all, I hope that it sends a, I have to get the distance just right between me and this microphone.
You don't need it in your mouth.
You don't need it that close. You can just stand right there, you're fine.
Okay. More than anything, I hope that this sends a message to our elected officials that, as I just mentioned, if they act outside the law, if they abuse their authority, there will be consequences. I hope that this acts as a deterrent to deter future actions like this. Also, I hope that it acts as an example to the public that regular, everyday people can get justice. I mean, there's a lot of injustice in our society. And the saddest thing that I ever hear anyone say is, yeah, there are a lot of problems in society. But what can I do about it? That's a very, very common sentiment. And I think that's very unfortunate. I like to make the point that regular everyday people can get justice, but they have to be willing to fight for it. This has been a 2-year-long ordeal. We've been against a city with bottomless pockets to pay for lawyers. We didn't have a lawyer. I was representing this myself. I'm a boat captain, all right? I'm not an expert in these matters. But it took me months of study in Law Society libraries to get acquainted with the laws and how to properly litigate a case, and we won, eventually. So I think that regular everyday people really underestimate their own power when they say that they can't do anything. It's really more a question of whether they're willing to do anything.
You're a boat captain? How'd you get involved in this?
Well, I mean, I got involved with Occupy in the first place because I think the working class has been getting the short end of the stick for a very long time. And I was tired of it. When Occupy came along, it really spoke to me. Occupy's main message was that the corporate interest is taking precedent in our society over the social interest. I mean, the needs of everyday human beings are being thrown away by the wayside. Meanwhile, corporations rake in record profits. It doesn't seem fair to me. And so that's why I got involved with Occupy in the first place. And when this situation happened, when Mr. Woodside and Murray Jamer, who's the city engineer, director of engineering and public works, when they gave us letters that accused us of breaking the law, I actually read the laws that they accused us of violating, and I didn't find anything that we were violating. And so I took it to a lawyer, and the lawyer said the same thing, and he said, "This is bizarre. I've practiced criminal law for 30 years. I've never seen anything like this." And so it went from there. He actually wrote an article about it for Canadian Lawyer magazine. That's right, Fredericton made Canadian Lawyer magazine.
What about money? Is that going to be donated to charity?
Well, I can't speak for the other two, but as for myself, I'm going to donate, well, I haven't spent it yet. I'm going to donate it to a cause that I believe in when it comes along, perhaps the next Occupy. Who knows?
Is there going to be another Occupy?
Like a physical occupation?
Well, yes.
Well, there's no plan to. No, I don't plan to. I live in St. John now anyway, so even if one was set up here, it would be.
What boat do you captain?
Well, actually, I drive for the Reversing Falls jet boat rides. That's fun. They're fast, very fast.
So Occupy was really in the public eye 2 years ago, and much of the hubbub has kind of died down a little bit, but you believe that the sentiment is still there. How do you capitalize on this now, especially in the dead of winter when you can't go set up a tent?
Well, I mean, the tent in itself was really just a protest tactic in the first place. It was never the message of the movement. What happened was that it got focused on far too much and far more than I would have liked. So I'll talk a bit about tents in general, the purpose in protesting. Sit-in protests are not at all uncommon. In fact, they're very common. You might remember in the late 90s, there was a big sit-in protest in Nova Scotia about Sydney Steel. Essentially what happened was Sydney Steel in Cape Breton polluted a bunch of people's houses with arsenic. And so to protest the provincial government's lack of action on the matter, a group of people set up a sit-in protest right across from the Premier's house. And it was a big one. They had 13 big tents, they had swimming pools, outhouses, everything, and they were set up. Nobody cared. Why? Because there wasn't constant media attention on it. There was so much, so much fervor about the fact that we had a tent that it really started to get in the way of the more important messages, and that I thought was unfortunate. If you want to take a look at Fredericton, well, Monsieur Leblanc here was living on the legislature grounds, as I recall, for 6 months, protesting the overprescription of Ritalin. Actually, that's when I first met you, Charles, back in 2003.
Time flies.
On the legislature lawn. And in 2004, there was actually a sit-in protest in Officer Square to protest various issues related to poverty. And Woodside tried to throw them out too, by the way. But they ended up going to the Centennial Building eventually. So, and what was the rest of your question? I go on for a while sometimes.
I'm wondering, because the Occupy sentiment has sort of fallen out of public favor a little bit. It's not making the news every day. Where do you go from here?
Well, actually, as I was saying earlier, we hope that this kind of spurs people on to realize that they can make a difference in their society. So one thing we're doing is we've actually organized a conference for January 25th at Odell Park Lodge from 1 to 4 p.m. And we're going to discuss ways that average everyday people can become more involved in democracy and effective ways to make a difference from a grassroots level. You know, I've never thought that democracy is just an exercise in going to a ballot once every 4 years and making a little check mark and hoping that politicians take over from there and make everything right. I've never believed that that's what democracy is about. I mean, certainly there is a role for elections, but there's got to be more to it than that. I think that a healthy democracy requires people to be active and involved and informed and to do things to better their community themselves, not just hope that others do it for them.
Are there any specific claims?
What's your event called?
It's called Occupy Activism.
Are there any specific claims?
I didn't name it, Dana named it.
Anything specific that the mayor said that you wanted to dispute?
Oh, yes. Let's get to that. Okay. So, let's see here. First, I was going to say, before he left, that I was glad that nobody's more glad than I am that this ordeal is finally coming to an end. As I mentioned, it's been 2 years plus 3 days now since they tore down the tent, and something like this was destined to happen eventually. I'm glad it's finally coming to an end. However, I was quite dismayed about the continual chest thumping on the part of Mr. Woodside. This was supposed to be an apology. In fact, the public statement that he was supposed to read but didn't actually included an apology. So I'll read the public statement that he was supposed to read in a moment. This really didn't come off as an apology. He said, oh yeah, legally I was in the wrong. I tried to shove that issue aside. Yet he just made up laws that don't exist and accused his own constituents of violating it and then enforced those fictional laws against them. That's a pretty significant issue, really. But he just kind of downplayed that and then started to attack us based on money. He's implying that we're greedy, really? Did he really think that we fought 2 years for, I mean, my share of the settlement's about $4,800. You think I fought 2 years for that? It's nonsensical, it really is. And then he started to say that Mr. Davenport intended to stay in front of City Hall forever. That's really not what happened. And then he kept talking about there was a drunk guy there. Yeah, there was a drunk man. He wasn't one of us. There was a drunk guy on the street when he came to talk to us. It was New Year's Eve in Fredericton. Of course, there's a drunk guy around. There was a drunk guy stumbling by and he saw the mayor. He's like, hey, Brad Woodside, buy me a house. It was just nonsense. But he was trying to impute that that had something to do with us. I was really disappointed by a lot of what Mr. Woodside said. So before I go on, I'm going to read the public statement that we agreed would be read by the city in our settlement. On October 15th, 2011, Occupy Fredericton began a political protest in Phoenix Square outside Fredericton City Hall. As part of this political protest, Occupy Fredericton erected a structure in Phoenix Square. On December 31st, 2011, the City of Fredericton provided written notice to members of Occupy Fredericton that they had 3 days' notice to remove any and all structures that were located in Phoenix Square pursuant to Section 5 of Bylaw T4, a bylaw respecting streets and sidewalks. On January 3rd, 2012, members of the City of Fredericton Public Works Department removed this structure. The City of Fredericton acknowledges that the right of members of Occupy Fredericton to protest is protected by Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The City of Fredericton has reviewed this matter as a result of litigation with 3 members of Occupy Fredericton, Julian Renaud, Dana Hart, and Alex Davenport, and has concluded that the city's bylaws in place as of January 3rd, 2012 did not provide the City of Fredericton with authority to remove the Occupy Fredericton structure without further order of the court. The City of Fredericton issues this statement to publicly apologize to Julian Renaud, Dana Hart, and Alex Davenport, and other members of Occupy Fredericton for removing this structure without appropriate authority. Further, the city has provided compensation to Julian Renaud, Dana Hart, and Alex Davenport to compensate them for the loss of personal belongings during the removal of the structure and other damages they suffered as a result of removing the structure and in settlement of their action against Mayor Brad Woodside, the City of Fredericton, and Murray Jane. So in that statement, in no uncertain terms, they admit that we were not breaking the law. They removed the structure without lawful authority. They apologized to us, and then they provided financial compensation for our property damage. And it says other damages here because lawyers don't want to say this explicitly, but for the violation of our civil rights. We had every right to our protest, and they took that right away from us. Now, Mr. Woodside, there is another issue that I should raise. Mr. Woodside has said over and over again this was only about the fact that someone was living there. That's why they had to go in. There are a number of facts that show that this is not the case. First thing, Mr. Woodside was trying to get rid of the tent long before Mr. Davenport changed his address. You might remember the Christmas tree lighting ceremony. Mr. Woodside insisted that we had to leave for the Christmas tree lighting ceremony, which was late November that we spoke about it, and early December of 2011 when that ceremony happened. He suggested that our tent was in the way of the tree. By the way, photographic evidence is quite clear. Our tent was over 30 feet away from the tree. So anyway, the Christmas tree lighting ceremony was a pretext to try to get rid of us. Just as Mr. Davenport's change of address was a pretext for Mr. Woodside to try to get rid of us. The reason had nothing to do with the fact that Davenport had changed his address. Now, Mr. Woodside has suggested that he had no idea that he was legally in the wrong until after we sued him. Well, I'm not sure if Mr. Woodside is being deceptive on this or if his memory is faulty, but if he was still here, I would refresh his memory about what he said to the media in the weeks leading up to his action against us. But since he's not here, I'll just I'll read some excerpts that shows that he knew that we were not breaking the law. So in the Daily Gleaner on November 25th, 2011, on page A1, here's an excerpt. The mayor said he's disappointed the group won't relinquish the public square, but he's not ready to physically remove the group. This Occupy movement here and all across North America has caught a lot of people off guard. What I mean by that is the ability to go in and physically remove people. We don't have, at present, the legislation because we've never dealt with anything like this before. We have got to get the legal legs beneath us. That was a quote from Mayor Woodside. The mayor said he's meeting with legal and senior staff to put together legislation that will address Occupy movements or any other public protests where people encamp in public spaces. Well, if they were putting together legislation that would deal with this, I think it shows that they knew that they didn't have legislation at the time to deal with it already. In other words, if we were breaking the law already, why would they need to pass a new law to make this illegal? By the way, they did pass that new law, bylaw L12, bylaw respecting public squares, on April 23rd of 2012, about 3.5 months after they moved against us. I'll get to that in a moment. Now the next excerpt. Occupy Mayor reached temporary truce. That's the title of the article. It was published in the Daily Gleaner on November 29th, 2011 on page A3. And this is a quote from Woodside. The negotiations continue, and we're also putting into place through our legal department things that we can use to deal with this in the future. Then on January 3rd, immediately, well, very soon after, just a few hours after, the shelter was destroyed by city crews, Mayor Woodside had an interview with Terry Sege from the CBC. Now this is what Terry Sege said. He asked him a question. Are you then thinking about legislation that would be put in place which would prevent this kind of protest from occurring again? Then Mayor Woodside said, in any public space, crack or crevice, absolutely. Crack or crevice, really? Well, I think that this shows, and there are about a half dozen other media excerpts I could get into, but I think the point is quite clear. Mr. Woodside knew that there were legal issues with moving against us. He knew that we were not breaking the law, And of course, how could he not know that? He had a city lawyer. The lawyer would have told him that we're not violating the law. They were well aware of this, and they moved against us anyway. Since we weren't breaking any laws, they just invented a law, a fictional bylaw provision, and said that we were violating it, and then used it against us. I think that is the most dishonorable and dishonest conduct that I have ever seen personally from any politician that I've personally been involved with. Now, I have a few responses to other things that Mr. Woodside said. Let's see. Oh, he was talking about the payment of the financial settlement. And it was asked who was paying it, and he said the city is paying it. Well, according to bylaw A3, bylaw A3 mentions what should happen when public officials get sued. Now, section 3.02 of bylaw A3 essentially says that the city normally will pay the legal costs for its city officials when they get sued for carrying out their duties. However, it says that's subject to section 3.04. Section 3.04 indicates that the city will not pay the legal costs of its officials when they have been grossly negligent, when they've acted contrary to the terms and conditions of employment, when they've acted contrary to an order given by a person in a position of authority, or if they have brought about or contributed to the claim by reason of fraud or dishonesty. Well, they accused us of violating bylaw provisions that don't even exist. What could possibly be more dishonest than that? The city should not have to pay the costs of this lawsuit. Mr. Woodside and Mr. Jamer should have to pay for it out of their own pockets. After all, what kind of a message would it send to our public officials if the city covered for their indiscretions? It would send a message that they can do whatever they want. They can abuse their power as much as they want. And the only consequence of them is that they might have to make a public statement 2 years after the fact. I think that they should have to pay for this themselves. And of course, there's one other section of the bylaw which is, I think, probably quite scandalous. Section 3.03 of bylaw A3 says that even if the city does decide to indemnify its officials, in other words, pay their legal costs, that decision has to be made by City Council. That decision was not made by City Council. It wasn't even discussed according to one of the city clerks. Mayor Woodside decided to pay the cost of the lawsuit out of city funds himself. He essentially forgave himself for his own misconduct. He is, along with the city treasurer, he signed the checks himself, going behind city council's back in the process. And that's in blatant violation of Fredericton's own bylaw A3. I don't think that that's right. I don't think that he's learned his lesson, quite frankly. The lesson being that as a public official, he has a responsibility to follow the rule of law and to always keep in mind where the bounds of his authority are. And I think that he's overstepped the bounds of his authority many times in this instance.
You sound bitter over all this. What's the point in rehashing all this now that the settlement's been made? Why not move forward?
It's not rehashing, it's hashing. The settlement only became official today.
You are bitter though, are you not?
Bitter? I am upset that Mr. Woodside said we agreed in the settlement that Mr. Woodside was going to apologize and that he was going to read this public statement. And he has broken his own word. He did not read the public statement, and quite frankly, this was not an apology. Yes, I'm upset when people break their word. Of course. Now, I wouldn't say that I am bitter. I'm just a citizen who is concerned that his public officials have acted well outside the bounds of their authority, and they're not atoning for any of their abuses of power.
Maybe it's me that's sick, but didn't he say he was wrong? And didn't he say he was wrong?
He said that he was legally wrong, but he said that essentially implied that he did the right thing and had honest, pure motives at heart. I think the facts show that he most certainly did not. He was well aware of the fact that we were not breaking the law, and he moved against us anyway. Essentially, Mr. Woodside has made the argument that he may have done the wrong thing, but he did it for the right reasons. I don't need to get into the history of that argument or what political leaders around the world have used that argument. Suffice it to say, it isn't a very good one, and I'm very dismayed that it's being used in Canada in the 21st century.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a very hypothetical question, but
Sure.
what do you think would have happened to the Occupy camp if it was not torn down?
We would have taken it down ourselves. In fact, we had plans to take it down.
Okay. When were you going to take it down?
Within a week or two. We were waiting for a nice warm day. The thing is, ironically, Mr. Woodside ensured that we were going to stay there a bit longer by bullying us so much. When Mr. Woodside handed us those letters accusing us of violating laws that don't even exist, we weren't going to leave. For that reason, no, we weren't going to be intimidated. And you have to keep in mind, in the weeks leading up to this, Mr. Woodside defamed us in the media quite a bit. I mean, he was saying that we were violating our own safety rules, which we were not, and we proved that we were not. He implied that we were defecating all over City Hall property, which is absurd. No, we were not. So he caused a lot of distrust of him and his motives in the weeks leading up. The best thing that Mr. Woodside could have done is just not get involved. Frankly, I don't think it was any of his business to be involved the way he was. He's not a law enforcer. Even if he was a law enforcer, we weren't breaking any laws, and we would have had nothing to enforce.
So is this done?
Is
the
this
settlement out today? Is this done, or?
Well, depends on your definition of done, I suppose. I mean, there's no more legal action, if that's what you mean. I mean, the matter's not going to court.
I guess what would be left if not legal? What would be left?
Well, I mean, obviously we're continuing with our efforts to get people involved with their democracy and try to make a difference, because I think it's very obvious that there are serious issues in our society. When this kind of thing can happen in a modern Western democracy, when public officials can literally accuse their own constituents of breaking laws that don't exist and get away with it, I think it's quite clear that there are a lot of problems. There are problems with public accountability. There are problems with the way that things are being reported. And I don't mean to aim this at any of the reporters in the room, but the media, at the time that we filed the lawsuit, no media outlet in Fredericton reported the allegation that the laws that we were accused of violating don't exist. As for why that happened, well, you probably know better than I do. I have no idea how that elephant in the room didn't make it into the headlines. I think that that was a very substantial allegation. And since that did make it into the headlines, you know, this whole thing came off as frivolous. You know, we came off, ironically, we came off as the bad guys when this first hit the media, because it looked like we had no case. It looked like we were not suing for any good reasons. But frankly, we were right all along. We were accused of violating laws that don't exist. I think that we had a very good reason to sue. And I think that we could not in good conscience let the mayor and the city engineer get away with what they did. So we had to. We had to act to ensure that the truth got out. Now, Mr. Woodside, a couple times during his spiel there, was rewriting history. He said in our first settlement negotiation sessions that they broke down because we wanted money. He said that he was fine with the issues of principle and admitting fault and all that, but it broke down because we wanted money. Actually, that's the exact opposite of what happened. The negotiations broke down because he wasn't willing to admit any fault. And I can prove that, actually. I have so Mr. Woodside probably hoped that I just threw all the documents down the proverbial memory hole after those settlement negotiations happened. But I actually have a document written by Woodside himself which proves that he was not willing to admit the fault. He was not willing to admit that the bylaws were misrepresented or that we weren't breaking the law. And that's ultimately what caused the first settlement negotiations, I'm talking about the ones in July of 2012, to break down. The settlement negotiations this time around were successful because they were willing to admit fault. And as for why they were willing to admit fault, it's probably because we had a court date in a few weeks. Either they were going to admit fault then, or they were going to be dragged to court and the judge would admit fault for them, which politically I think would be much, much worse. I mean, this might be provincial headlines, but it would have been national headlines had this gone to court. So I think this was really an act of damage control. He is right about one thing, though. It was less expensive to settle out of court this way than it would have been to take it to court, because as Mr. Woodside acknowledged to the Daily Gleaner on December 5th of 2013, they were going to lose in court. Not only would they have lost the expensive lawsuit, they also would have had to pay much higher legal bills at this kind of court. So he was correct about that. Now, Mr. Woodside mentioned that police were not used to tear down the Occupy structure. That's true. I don't even dispute that. I don't know who might have put on Twitter at some point that police were tearing it down. It wasn't me. It was public works employees, City of Fredericton outside workers, the same people who take down tree branches and drive snow plows and so on. There were 9 of them, and they destroyed the shelter.